Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and begin a Bible class. Scott is in New Mexico this weekend, so I'm filling in for him. In case you didn't know, my name is David Brockway, and even if you did know, I'm still the same name, Dave Brockway. And today, we're going to be covering chapters 4 through 14 of Job. So that's 10 chapters, and I did a little bit of math. That's about 4 minutes a chapter. So we're going to have to take a whirlwind tour of these 10 chapters. But just real quick to summarize, you might think of Job being divided into 3 sections. There's Job's dilemma, where he's stricken in 2 stages by Satan. First, an assault on his belongings and then on his body. And then we have this long section from chapter 3 to 37, which are the debates of Job. And then finally, the last part is the deliverance of Job in chapters 38 through 42. And so what we're going to look at in chapter 3 through 14, this is the first cycle of debates. There's actually 4 cycles of debates, culminating in Elihu's rebuttal of Job. So it's kind of like you got Job and then one of his friends, and then Job and then the other one of his friends, and so on. So like in this section, we have Job's very first speech, and then Eliphaz is the first one to respond to Job, and then Job responds to that. And then Bildad speaks up, and he has his point of view, and then Job responds to Bildad. And then Zophar is the last of the 3, and then, of course, Job responds to that. So that's kind of the cycle. Before we get too far into this, I want to say a few words about the role of Satan in the book of Job, and I think this is really important. Out of the 66 books of the Bible, the name Satan appears in only 16 of them, and that's less than 1/4 of the Bible books. And when I looked that up, I did the counting myself, and it really surprised me, because as important as Satan and sin and evil is to God's plan of salvation, I'm just surprised a little bit that the name Satan doesn't come up more often. Now, there are obviously allusions to the devil or the evil one or something to that effect, but the name itself only shows up in 16 books, and of the 16 that do mention Satan, it's used more in the book of Job than anywhere else. Now, that I did not know until I prepared for the class. So Job has that more than any other, and not only that, but it's all concentrated in the very first the first 2 chapters of the book of Job. After those 2 chapters and the remaining 40 chapters of the book, there's no mention of Satan at all. I mean, here these various men are going round and round about sin and evil and suffering and all this, and there's not a peep about Satan. And I think that's important. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. Some Bible scholars believe that this lengthy central section from about like chapter 3 on to maybe 37, that may have been written by Job himself, or at least faithfully recorded by someone about Job. And anyway, that's like the dialogue with Job and his friends. But then the prologue, which is really the first 2 chapters where we have the introduction to Job, what kind of the person he is, and Satan's plan, that may have been added centuries later by Moses. I think it's quite possible. And also maybe the very conclusion of Job may have been added by Moses under inspiration. And so I think it's really significant that the major central section where we actually have Job and his contemporaries talking back and forth, debating back and forth with each other, that none of the speakers ever mentioned Satan. And that's important because apparently they lived in a place and at a time where they were unaware of the writings of Moses. Because if they were, they would have read Genesis, they would have known the story about the fall of man and so on. So apparently these speakers had no knowledge of the existence of Satan or of the fall of man. They were unaware of the ongoing spiritual warfare that has plagued mankind ever since. And I think that's really important to understanding the book of Job, that they were going on limited information. Job's friends blamed Job himself for his misfortunes, and we know that's wrong. Job, because he didn't know about the existence of Satan, Job was blaming God because he figures, well, God is in control of everything, and whatever happens is because of God, so it must be God doing this to me. And unfortunately, they were all wrong. Their theology was off. Satan and his evil influence are behind sin and behind human misery. But the people living in Job's world were unaware of Satan's role in this. And I think that if you understand that, they're going on limited knowledge. We're living in the 21st century. We have the benefit of living on this side of the cross. And so we know a lot more about God's plan of salvation. We have the Old Testament prophets to read. We have the New Testament writings. We know, obviously there's a lot we don't know, but we know a lot more than they knew. And I think if you understand, that's where they were coming from. They had limited knowledge of God and the spiritual world. And so maybe that'll help us be a little bit more sympathetic to some of the assertions that Job and his friends make, because they were just doing the best with what they had. Now, last week, Scott gave us a summary of chapter 3, so that was Job's first speech. So I'm going to start in with chapter 4 and on. And with chapter 4 and 5, we have the first speech of one of Job's so-called comforters, Eliphaz. And just in general, it kind of surprises me that his friends don't even seem to give him the benefit of the doubt. It's like they just assume from the very beginning, well, if you're suffering, then you must have sinned. You must have done something wrong. And so they kind of, the general gist is, well, you must have done something to deserve this. And they come down pretty hard, and I think you'll see that with each speaker, they come down even harder on him. Eliphaz actually starts out kind of gentle, actually even compliments Job a little bit, and says, well, you did comfort other people, you lifted other people up, you helped other people. He does give him credit for that. And my thinking is, even if Job did deserve it, they're really not showing any compassion. Even if Job did sin and brought it on himself, it may have been true to point that out, but that's not really the most helpful thing, is it? If somebody's suffering, maybe we ourselves or somebody we know made a really bad decision, and now they're suffering the consequences of it. Maybe we've sinned or something, and now we're suffering or someone else is suffering because of something bad that we did. And it may be true that we brought it on ourselves, but having somebody tell us that at the time, that's not really very helpful. And even if he deserved it, the point is that he's suffering and he's in misery, and if they really care about him, even if he deserved it, he ought to be getting some kind of comfort and encouragement or something, but they really don't give that to him, and it's unfortunate. All right. Well, I'm going to start off here with chapter 4 with that first speech. Excuse me. Well, like I said, at first, Eliphaz compliments Job. He says, yeah, you helped all these people out. But then he goes on to say, and now it's coming on you, and now you're upset or you're impatient. And I've seen two different takes on this. To me, it almost sounds like saying, well, you're real good about comforting and giving advice to other people, and now when it comes to you, it's like, why don't you take some of that good advice you've been giving to other people? Why don't you apply it to yourself? Or maybe, you've been helping other people, and now it comes to you, and you don't handle it so well. But on the other hand, another take is that, well, maybe he was complimenting Job and say, well, look, you've helped other people, and yes, you're suffering now, but if you really are an upright person, then the misery you're going through right now shouldn't really last very long. It ought to be over soon. So maybe he's trying to comfort him a little bit. And then in verse 7, I want to read something that Eliphaz says. He says, remember now, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? Now, I'll bet, and you've lived long enough, you could probably think plenty of examples where people, the basically good, decent, moral people, who suffered some tragedy or came down with some terrible illness, whereas there's other people that maybe live, very godless lives, very worldly, immoral lives, and yet they're prospering. They seem to be in good health. They have plenty of money. Things seem to go their way generally. So I think we just know from our own personal observation that this statement he makes there really doesn't add up. Doesn't really add up. Eliphaz is ignoring reality because bad things do happen to good people. There are accidents, there's illnesses, good people can be the victims of crime, and so on and so on. Jesus recalled the accident in which the Tower of Siloam in Jerusalem fell, causing the deaths of 18 people. And he stated that these people were no worse than anyone else in Jerusalem because his disciples thought, well, wonder what kind of sin these people did that God would make that happen to them. And Jesus was clarifying that error. So even in his day, people will still have this kind of thinking. And so Jesus was saying, no, they didn't deserve their fate. They weren't any worse than anybody else, just that accidents do happen. And so, but he points out because of that, because accidents do happen, you need to be ready at any time. Now, I want to share something that I think is related to this. In September of 2009, there were 5 members of the Park Plaza Church of Christ that died in an airplane accident here in Tulsa. Some of you, maybe you remember them. Some of you maybe even knew the people that perished in that. And one of them was Dr. Stephen Lester. He was the pilot. He was with his wife, Dana. They had their 2 teenage daughters. They were, the weather was kind of bad. They were on their way to the Dallas area to watch an OU game. And another person on board that plane was Dr. Ken Vedito. And Ken grew up in this congregation. My wife, Ting, she knew Ken and went to Oklahoma Christian University with him. They even took a music appreciation class together. One day they carpooled. So, she knew Ken personally. And I still remember Ken's father, Max Vedito. How many of you remember Max Vedito? Okay, I see probably a good half of the auditorium here. So he was a member of this congregation up until 2004 when he passed away. So, it's kind of personal. And then Dr. Lester, the pilot, from what I read, he was very involved at the church at Park Plaza. He had recently returned from a mission trip to Africa. These were good, decent people. These were God-fearing people serving God. But they perished in a tragic accident. And what happened, they hadn't even left the Tulsa area. They were flying on the west side of Tulsa over Chandler Park. And the airplane hit a guy wire that was supporting an antenna. And I teach aviation ground school, and this is one of the case studies that I cover with my students because it's a good, it's got some good lessons for us. So I cover it with my students. And it's kind of personal, I guess, because they were members of the Lord's church and people here knew them. And sometimes I think to myself, is it possible that maybe God's invisible hand could have just secretly just nudged that airplane over maybe 20 feet, and they would have just barely missed that guy wire, and all 5 of them would have been alive maybe to this day? And I think about that, and for some reason, God chose not to do that. And we can speculate, we could spend more time outside of class speculating, but he didn't do that, and there was this accident. And so that brings up the question, that Job is partly addressing, or a lot of it's addressing, is why does a loving God allow tragedies to befall good people? Because again, I think Eliphaz definitely has it wrong here. Why does he let that happen? And here's just some thoughts to share with you on that. If people knew that they would be protected by simply living a certain way, or if they knew if they became a Christian or they became a believer in God, that God would protect them and keep anything bad happening to them, like the Lesters and Ken Vedito, then some people would come to God, but with the wrong motive, for selfish motives, that, well, it's like what they get out of it. And isn't that what Satan is alleging, right? That's what Satan is saying. Well, You put a hedge, you put like a protection around him because he follows you. He knows that as long as he follows you, everything's going to go just great, peachy in his life. And so that was what God was trying to prove, that no, Job is following me because he loves me. It's not because of what he gets out of it. And then number two, I don't think there's a good answer, but I just want you to think about this. What if we lived in a world where God always intervened, where we knew that God would always protect us from something bad that happened? Or if he didn't always do it, maybe he did at least sometimes. You might wonder, well, what's the criterion that God would use? At what, how often, or how would he make the decision that he's going to intervene to prevent something bad from happening? But can you imagine a world where God would not allow plane accidents to happen, or car accidents, or people to die from cancer, and so on? I don't know, but I can imagine that we would start getting complacent. We would let our guard down. We wouldn't try as hard. We wouldn't think as hard. I could see people saying, going on a drive somewhere, and someone says, well, aren't you going to fasten your seatbelt? And say, no, because I know God's not going to let anything bad happen to me, so why fasten my seatbelt? Why follow the speed limit? Because I know I'm not going to get in an accident. I just try to imagine what would the world look like if we knew that God would not let anything bad happen. And I think we probably would end up taking many things for granted. And I think if there's any positive out of the suffering that does happen, that even to good people, so-called good people, suffering reminds us not to be too attached to this world, right? Don't get too caught up in the things of this world. Don't trust in this world. Don't be too attached to it. We need to be focusing on the world to come. We really need to think about that. And I think the lesson from just observing these things from our day-to-day life, that bad things can happen to anybody. And I think the point is that we need to try to live a life so that at any moment that we are in a right relationship with God, so that if we suddenly get struck by something and die unexpectedly, that we're ready at any time and not take life for granted. So maybe that's the positive out of it. Well, moving on in the chapter, and I know I'm not going to get through all this, but I'll try what I can. In verses 12 to 21, Eliphaz tells a story. He relates this disturbing vision where he saw this phantom in the middle of the night, and basically the message of the phantom is that mankind is sinful before God. Well, there's some things about this vision. There's really no authority about it. The vision never claims to be a message from God. And instead of like boldly proclaiming the message, Eliphaz says it's kind of more mysterious or secret, not boldly proclaiming the message. And there are people, even to this day, there are people that base their beliefs on mysterious visions that they've had or dreams that they have had, and they treat it as if it's fact. And so I think we need to be really careful about that and compare that to what the Word of God says, because that's what's authoritative. Also, I want to point out something interesting here. In verse 18, he says, he's talking about God here. God puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. This is the only time in the book of Job where angels are mentioned. So one thing it tells me, whatever their limited knowledge was of God, they apparently didn't know about Satan and the fall of man, but they at least had some concept that there are angelic beings, some spirit beings that are serving God. So I thought that was interesting. And then we'll move on to chapter 5. Eliphaz is continuing this speech. He's calling Job foolish here. In verses 6 through 7, he says that trouble naturally comes to man. He says, for affliction does not come from the dust, neither does trouble spout from the ground, for man is born for trouble, as sparks fly upward. Well, that seems to contradict what he just got through saying earlier, that the only reason you have trouble is because you're sinful. But here he seems to say just the fact that you're a human being and you're living in this world, you're going to be encountering suffering. Anyway, Eliphaz's idea that disasters and calamities were due to sin, to the sin of those who suffered such things was generally accepted throughout the ancient world. That seemed to be the general idea. And Job seems to go against that idea. So he's it's almost like they're ganging up on him. I mean, here's Job suffering. He's already down. He's suffering so much. And these three, they're just kind of almost rubbing salt in the wound. It's like, yeah, we see you're suffering, but instead of comforting him, they say, yeah, you must have really done something bad to deserve it. And anyway, that seems to be a very common thought. Even in Jesus' day, people had that misunderstanding. Even the Lord's apostles assumed so. You remember the story about the man born blind? They asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And I've always kind of wondered about that statement. It's like, so he sinned and then he was born blind. It almost implies, well, he sinned before he was born. And I always kind of wondered what they were thinking when they said that. But they assumed that, well, he must have been born blind because there was something sinful about him or his parents sinned, and so this is God's payback, this is God's punishment. And of course, Jesus had to correct them again that that's not the way it works. Sin is the cause behind a lot of suffering, right? I mean, the reason there's suffering in the world is because of sin. People committing crime, or just the fact that we're living in a fallen world. But the idea that someone is suffering misfortune in direct proportion or in direct response to a sin is not true. That's not accurate. You understand what I'm saying? Yes, we may suffer something bad because there's sin in the world, but we're not necessarily suffering as a direct consequences of our own sin. It doesn't work that way. Now, in verses 9 and 11, he's talking about God here, and he says that God does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields, so that he sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. Well, I'll give him credit. Eliphaz, he got it right here. He was extolling the greatness of God. And this makes me think of something right now. Now, I mentioned about their theology. All of them, their theology was off a little bit. They have misunderstanding. But I want to give not just Job credit, but I want to give his three friends credit. Because remember, they were living at a time when the vast majority of people living on the earth were either animists, where they believed, they worshiped the forces of nature, or they were pagans, where they had like a multiple gods, all different kinds of gods for different things. So here they lived in that world, and yet Job and his three friends, and then later Elihu, at least they did believe in the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth. So I want to give them credit for that, even if they had some other things a little bit wrong. But he makes his point about how God raises up the humble and he brings down the mighty. And that's true, isn't it? I mean, even if you're rich and successful, that doesn't mean that a tornado or a fire can't come by and destroy your home. The stock market can still crash. No matter how rich and powerful you are, you can still come down with cancer, or you can have a heart attack. I mean, there's no guarantee that life's going to go your way all the time. And so the high people can be brought down. And the statement that he says here, it really it mirrors what Mary says in Luke 1 when she finds out that she's going to have this child through miraculous means. She says that God has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who are humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent away the rich empty-handed. And it very much is consistent with what Eliphaz is saying here. And moving on, verse 13, Eliphaz says that he captures the wise by their own shrewdness, and the advice of the cunning is quickly thwarted. And Paul says something very similar to this, if I can find it, in 1 Corinthians 3:19. He says something very similar to what Eliphaz says here about how people who are so crafty, they end up getting tripped up by their own craftiness. He says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God, for it is written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness." And in the little footnote here, it has a reference to Job 5:13. So Paul maybe had that statement in mind, or maybe it was coincidence, but it's very similar. In verse 17, Eliphaz, how happy is the man who God reproves, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. So he's talking about the chastening from God. And this, I'm kind of a little short on time, but there's a reference in Proverbs 3:11 where it says something to the effect of, do not despise chastening from the Lord. In Hebrews 12, verses 5 through 6, we're told that God does discipline those he loves. Now, sometimes, just because something's bad happening to us doesn't necessarily mean that that's God chastening us, but we know that God can use things in our life to correct us, to mature us, and so on. So that is a consistent idea. And in verse 25 and following, he's telling Job that someday your descendants, that if you're a righteous man, that your descendants will be many, and that basically you'll have a long, healthy life. And imagine how insensitive that is to say to someone whose whole family just got wiped out, except for his wife, but all of his children are wiped out. And he's saying, oh yeah, you're going to have all kinds of children, and you'll be prosperous, and that probably wasn't very well received. Well, Eliphaz finishes up here, and then in chapters 6 and 7, Job responds to what Eliphaz has to say. And these words from Job, they're spoken out of deep disappointment and pain. I mean, Job is suffering. He suffered the loss, economic loss, his children, and his servants. I don't know if we ever really think about that. It wasn't just his children who died. He lost a number of servants. And imagine he's going through all that. Even his wife wasn't really very supportive of him. And on top of that, people that he thought were friends that would comfort him are just kind of making it worse. It's almost like psychological or emotional trauma for him. So he's speaking this out of deep, deep sorrow. And he kind of points that out. I think if you look at chapter 6, verse 14, he says, for the despairing man, there should be kindness from his friend, lest he forsake the fear of the Almighty. He's saying, look, I'm a despairing person. I ought to get some kind of kindness. I should be getting comfort from you, but he wasn't getting that. And then in verses 22 through 23, he basically says, look, did I ever ask you guys for anything? I never asked you for anything. I don't want your money. I don't want anything. I just want some understanding. I just want some compassion here. And sometimes that may be, when somebody's suffering, that's maybe about all we can do. People, when they're down, even if they deserved what they got, that's not the time to lecture them about, see, if you hadn't done this, this wouldn't be happening to you right now. That's not real helpful. Maybe later they might be ready to accept that, but that's not really what they need at that moment. And unfortunately, they weren't helpful to Job. And then in verse 24 and following, he says, teach me and I will be silent, and show me how I have erred. He's basically saying here and following, he said, okay, you guys think this is all happening to me because of my sin. Well, all right. Well, tell me what I did. Tell me what my great sins were, okay? You guys seem to know so much. Tell me what I did to deserve this, or what would somebody have to do to get what I just got here? I mean, it'd have to be really bad. And then moving on to chapter 7. All right, chapter 7. Well, let me read verses 9 and 10. 9 and 10. When a cloud vanishes, it is gone. So he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. He will not return again to his house, nor will his place know him anymore. Well, Sheol, as you probably know, refers to the realm of the dead. In the Greek New Testament, that's referred to as Hades. It's the grave or the pit. It's just the place where the dead go. And some people might use this, I think erroneously, to say, Job didn't believe in an afterlife. But I don't think that's the case at all. Job does not abandon all hope after death. He simply states the truth, that the dead do not return. Once people die, the dead do not return to the people or the places of this life. He's not talking about spiritual death. He's talking about the death of the physical body, That body goes to the grave. It begins to decay. It's not like you're going to just go to sleep for a while and then come back and rejoin the life you once had. It's one time. And that's all he's saying. The dead don't return. But he's not saying that this is the end of existence. Let's see, I have a note here in verse 2. In verse 2, he says, as a slave who pants for the shade, and as the hired man who eagerly waits for his wages, so am I allotted months of vanity. Well, by that reference to the worker who looks forward to getting his wages, that seems to suggest this idea that Job did not regard the grave as the end, but he looked forward to a future reward. He realized that, yes, I'm toiling in this life, but someday there's going to be a future reward. Just like in the New Testament, we read about the Christian Sabbath. Not a day, but it's this idea that we're working in this life, and then someday there's going to be an eternal rest for us. And that seems to be what Job was referring to here. And even though we're not covering chapter 19, I think what he's saying here is very consistent with chapter 19 beginning in verse 25, where he talks about his Redeemer living. He said, and as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will make his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I will see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes shall see, and not another. And so if you look carefully, Job does, apparently by inspiration, he does believe that there's some kind of an afterlife. And I don't recall seeing his friends make any reference to an afterlife. And so I think that's important. In verses 17 and 18, we're still in chapter 7, verses 17 and 18, he says, what is man that thou dost magnify him, and that thou art concerned about him? Does that sound familiar? That very much echoes the words of the psalmist in Psalm 8:4. What is man that you're mindful of him, or that you visit him? And here it's a little bit more of a negative. It's like, we're so weak and puny. Why are you scrutinizing us so much? Why are you so interested in us? The psalmist seems to say, like, we're so small, and yet you've endowed us with all this prominence. We seem to be so important to you. But it's very much the idea there. And I want to point out something. I really enjoy James Kaufman's commentaries. I think he's got a lot of insight, and I used a lot of his commentary to prepare for today. Excuse me. There's something that he points out in his commentary. He states that one of the most significant things in Job is the frequency and the persistence in which Job turns again and again to God. Through all of his agonized protests, there runs the perception that God cannot be entirely against him, and that God alone is the answer to all our misfortunes. So yes, Job is upset. He's probably bewildered and puzzled, like, what did I do? Why is God doing this to me? And he just can't figure it out because, again, he doesn't know the backstory that you and I have. It's just like, maybe you've watched a movie where there's kind of an intricate plot and the characters really don't know what's going on. I think a really good example would be like if you've ever read the book or watched the movie Killers of the Flower Moon, that it just sort of seems like random events, and to the people living at the time, it wasn't real obvious what was going on, at least to some people. But we have the benefit of, knowing the background. We kind of have the inside scoop, and so we have that with Job. But Job and his contemporaries, they didn't have that. They didn't really know what was going on. So Job's bewildered, and he's questioning God, but deep down, I think he still has this idea that I still want to be, serve God. I still love God, and I believe that God is basically fair, and maybe that's why he's so puzzled. Like, I know God is good. I know God is fair. So I just can't figure out why this is happening to me, because he figures that, well, God's in control of everything. So if this is happening to me, then it must be God's will. But again, he didn't have the whole story here. Now we're going to move on to chapter 8. Chapter 8. This is Bildad's first speech. So he's the second of Job's friends to speak out. He starts out calling his suffering friend, he calls him basically a bag of wind. Or maybe we might say nowadays, you're just expelling a lot of hot air. He goes on to say that God does not pervert justice. So he has the gall to say, well, basically he's implying that he says Job's children must have gotten what they deserved. When God wiped them out, they must have done something really bad. They must have gotten what they deserved. And then in verses 8 through 10, he's appealing to the wisdom of previous generations as his authority on spiritual matters. Well, just because somebody lived before or a long time ago, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have more insight than anybody else, does it? Sometimes people can be mature and still be wrong about things. And then in verse 20 through 22, he suggests that people of integrity will prosper. Some people today still believe that prosperity is an evidence of righteous living. But I think we can think of many cases of people living immoral lives. They have money, they're very popular, they have a lot of influence, they enjoy good health, while people living godly, righteous lives, trying to serve God to the best of their ability, they don't enjoy these things. They're going through cancer treatment, and they die prematurely, and they get divorced, and just, different bad things happen to them. And so it's not necessarily the case the way that Bildad thought. Then in verse 20, the very first part of it, he says, God will not reject a man of integrity, nor will he support evildoers. Bildad's assertion here is similar to those who mocked Jesus on the cross, using the same logic, that God won't reject a man of a good person. When Jesus was on the cross, they said, well, he trusts in God. Let him deliver him now if he takes pleasure in him. They're saying, yeah, if you're such a righteous person, then God will deliver you. And of course, that's faulty. Moving on to chapters 9 and 10, we see Job's response to what Bildad had to say. And in verses 1 through 12, Job perceives that God is the creator of all things and that God is a spiritual being that's invisible to mortal man. So he had a fundamental understanding of the nature of God. And one thing that's interesting, verse 9, he's mentioning 3 of the constellations that we know today. One is, it's called the Bear here. Scientifically, we call it Ursa Major, but most of us probably know it better as the Big Dipper. So they make reference to the Big Dipper, the constellation Orion, which is very prominent in the winter sky. That's that constellation with those 3 stars that go in a row in the belt of Orion. It also makes a reference to the Pleiades. And these 3 constellations are mentioned by God later in chapter 38. They're also mentioned by the prophet Amos in Amos chapter 5. In verses 13 to 24, Job declares that God destroys both the good and the bad alike. The ancients believe that whatever happened is God's will because he allows it, so therefore everything that happens must or can be attributable to God. So by saying that God brings misfortune to good people as well as the evil, at least Job was a little bit closer to the truth than his friends, right? Because they thought, well, only the bad people suffer. Job says, no, even the good people suffer. But he was still wrong because he's attributing all that suffering to God. Now, we know God, if we have the right attitude, God can use suffering. God, according to Romans 8, we know that God can make something good come out of something that's bad. But he doesn't necessarily bring it on. And so we know that. Because of later revelation, we know that the real problem is attributable to the malignant activity of Satan. And God gave mankind the freedom of will. God allowed us to choose. And I'm sure that wasn't easy. He could have programmed us like robots and made us so we could only do good, so we could only follow God. But he gave us free will, so that way, if we do follow God, nobody's coercing us to do it. Nobody's forcing it. We're not compelled to do it. We're doing it because we genuinely want to follow God. We genuinely want to comply and be in harmony with his will. So he gives mankind free will. And that, unfortunately, that comes with a high price, because it means we can also choose to do what's evil, which can not only hurt us, but it can hurt other people. And we know that, we've all probably been the recipients of somebody who chose to do evil. And we've been harmed as a result of that, or we know people have been harmed because of that. So when people choose to do what's evil, contrary to God's will, it does come at the expense of others. In verses 25 and 35 of chapter 9, Job makes a prophetic plea that there might be some kind of an umpire. In verse 33, he says, "There is no umpire between us who may lay his hand upon us both." In the King James, it refers to him as a daysman. We might think of it maybe as a referee or maybe as a mediator. The word here in Hebrew means to reason, to reprove, or to decide. So right here, Job was putting forth the concept of a mediator. And in this prophetic longing, Job is reaching out for that one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ. So already he's thinking, I wish there was somebody who could kind of act between me and God, like that maybe could be kind of like call the rules to make sure that it's fair, maybe act as sort of an intermediary between the two parties where there seems to be some conflict, and this person kind of is a go-between. And of course we know that ultimately was fulfilled in Jesus, who was not only 100% God, but also a 100% man. And so I think Job obviously feels like, before Almighty God, how do I have a chance of adequately defending myself? If only I had like a representative or somebody who could kind of go between us. Now, moving on to chapter 11, this is Zophar's first speech. So this is the last of Job's three friends to talk to him. And Zophar has the same old story as Eliphaz and Bildad, but even a worse attitude. In verses 1 through 6, Zophar is charging Job with gross wickedness. In fact, if I remember right, he even kind of suggests that maybe you even deserve worse than what you're getting, Job. And I'm not really sure how he could have gotten much worse than what he got. And then in verse 7 through 12, he accuses Job of being ignorant of God. And it just surprises me that these friends, they really don't know Job's intimate life. They don't know really what he's thinking day to day. They don't know what his life is like every day. They're making a lot of assumptions here, aren't they? And they're not very helpful assumptions. In verses 13 through 20, Zophar promises restoration if Job will just come clean. If you'll just confess your sins and repent, then maybe God will relent. Well, in response to this, chapters 12 through 14, 3 chapters, we have Job's response to Zophar. So this is Job's fourth speech. In chapter 12, the first 6 verses, Job denies that his comforters had any knowledge that he himself did not possess. And actually, he says something I think is kind of funny. In verse 2, he says, "Truly, then you are the people, and with you wisdom will die." It's almost like, wow, you guys are just so great. You know so much that you know it all. And when you guys go away, man, that you're going to be such a big loss to the world because you think you know everything. And so sarcasm was, they understood sarcasm 3,000 years ago. And then in verse 7 through 12, Job appealed to the lower creations, even to the animals, to make his point. And then I'm going to have to skip ahead. I'm going to go to chapter 14 because we're running out of hand. In verses 7 through 12, he says, "Man dies, and then where is he?" He said something to the effect that, "I'll be in the grave until the heavens are destroyed." Verse 12, if I could find that, 14:12. He says, all the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes, until my change comes. So there he seems to suggest he understands about the resurrection and the transformation of his body into a spiritual one. And then he says, you'll call, I will answer you. You will wait for the work of your hands. And now I can't find it, but it's something about till the heavens be destroyed. And that echoes what Peter says in 2 Peter 3:10 about the heavens burning up with fervent heat and so on. So Job expresses his hope of a resurrection of the dead. So we see, compared to his friends, we do see some snippets of prophecy of God's plan of redemption to come. So I told you it was a whirlwind tour. We 10 chapters in about 45 minutes. I appreciate your attention, and Scott should be back with you next Sunday to pick up with chapter 15. So thank you and have a good day.